Welcome back, third graders. We're going to work more today on reading Below Deck, a Titanic story. And I want to kind of point out to you, remember this unit that we're working on in reading is all about being an active citizen. And this story is going to show you that, but in a little bit of a different way. So we've been reading really about people who have courage to stand up for what they believe is right. And so in this story today, you're going to learn a little bit about another kind of courage. And it's really the kind of the courage to help others in times of danger. So if you can think about what you know about the Titanic, you know that there's a danger that's going to happen. And obviously by looking at the cover, right, you know that there's some disaster that's going to happen. And you're going to learn today about courage and how people can help other people during those times of need. Okay, we're going to start on chapter 4 today. There are 2 chapters that we're going to read. So chapter 4. It was just before midnight. The partygoers headed up through the hallways toward the main deck, and Grace followed them. A lot of other people from the first and second class decks were doing the same. On the main deck, a large crowd was quickly gathering by the rail. The night air was freezing, and the stars glittered in the dark sky above them. The sea was strangely calm, and everybody was looking up at something white and glittering and enormous drifting past the stationary ship. Grace had never seen anything like it. "It's an iceberg," one man yelled. "We've hit an iceberg, and we're going to sink." People in the crowd looked around, worried, and started to mutter to each other. Surely this man was talking nonsense. Suddenly, the bow of the ship lurched downward with a terrible, grinding noise. Moments later, one of the crew cried out that the captain had given the order to lower the lifeboats. They were going to abandon ship. You can see that iceberg in the distance. Grace felt very scared and alone. She thought of Auntie Nora until tears filled her eyes. She couldn't believe the Titanic was sinking. The newspapers had said that the ship was unsinkable, but now lifeboats were splashing down into the sea. As Grace stood motionless in the chaos around her, word spread that there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone on board, and people started to panic. You can see Grace. She stands out, doesn't she, in her green coat and dress and her red hair. Soon, there was a lot of yelling and screaming and pushing and shoving, but Grace couldn't leave the ship without Uncle Patrick's address or Auntie Nora's photograph. She had to go back to the cabin for her suitcase before trying to find a place on a lifeboat. I want you to think about how Grace might be feeling if you were in that situation. When Grace reached the staircases leading down to the third-class decks, she found they had been closed off. She had to go a different way, but soon she was lost inside the ship's maze of hallways. "Come on, think," she whispered to herself. "Now, where do I go?" Just then, the floor shook beneath Grace's feet, and the ship groaned and creaked around her. The lights flickered above her. Tears streamed down Grace's cheeks as she realized she would have to leave her belongings behind and return to the main deck. She was running out of time, and she had never felt so alone. But she pulled herself together, wiped her eyes on her sleeve, and strode quickly toward the stairs. Getting back to the main deck wasn't easy, though. All the hallways were at steep angles now, and in some places, Grace had to pull herself along the wall as if she were climbing a mountain. The lights were flickering even more, and everywhere seemed eerily empty. At last, she spotted someone ahead of her, a girl. As Grace got closer to her, she realized it was Katherine, the girl who had gotten her in trouble. Their eyes met, and Grace knew Katherine recognized her too. Katherine ran up to Grace and grabbed her arm, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, you have to help me," said Katherine, her voice cracking. "I got separated from my parents, and I'm lost. I don't know what to do." "Let go of me," Grace snapped. She pulled her arm free. Why should I help you after what you did? You must be joking. Grace turned away from her. I'm sorry, Katherine was screaming. Don't leave me. Grace stopped with her back to Katherine and closed her eyes. She remembered what Auntie Nora had said. You're too nice for your own good sometimes. That was true, but Grace also knew it would be wrong to leave Katherine here alone. She sighed and turned back. All of a sudden, the lights went out, plunging them into darkness. Chapter 5. Katherine screamed. Grace knew she would have to take charge, even though she felt terrified herself. The two girls stumbled in the dark as she dragged Katherine along the hallway. After a while, they came to an area where the lights were still flickering, but now the floor started to shake, and the hallway seemed to tip even more sharply. Grace felt like she was in a nightmare as they turned down hallway after hallway. But at last, they came to a staircase that Grace recognized. It would take them to the main deck. They climbed upward, only to discover that things had gotten much worse. The Titanic was creaking and groaning like a giant beast in agony, and its front part was now completely underwater. I love the illustration. Most of the lifeboats had been launched, but there still seemed to be as many passengers on board the Titanic as ever. Grace saw quite a few people struggling into life preservers and jumping into the icy sea far below. Come on, this way, Grace said, and she pulled Katherine toward a lifeboat that hadn't been launched yet. Suddenly, a voice called out, Katherine! Oh, thank goodness we found you. It was Katherine's mother pushing through the crowd. She grabbed her daughter and held her tight. Katherine's father appeared from the crowd. We must hurry, he said. They won't be able to launch the lifeboat if they have to wait any longer. The three of them started moving toward the ship's rail, Katherine's father roughly pushing people out of the way. Grace followed and found herself at last looking down into a lifeboat. It was almost full, but there were still a few free places. A couple of the crew helped Katherine and her parents into the boat through a gate in the rail. Just as Grace was about to climb down into the boat herself, one of the crewmen put his arm out to stop her. Hold it, he said, looking Grace up and down. Only first-class passengers are allowed in this lifeboat. Shame on you, a man yelled behind Grace. Others angrily called out too. Grace stood, shivering in the cold night air, jostled by the crowd, her eyes filling with tears once more. But she saved me, Katherine said quietly to her father. You can see Katherine and her family right here. Katherine's father stood up. Let her on, he said to the crewman. She's with us. The man nodded and helped Grace down into the lifeboat. She sat on the bench next to Katherine, who squeezed her hand. I couldn't let them leave you behind, said Katherine. I'd still be lost if it hadn't been for you. Grace looked up at Katherine's parents, who were watching them. Thank you, Katherine's mother whispered to her through an exhausted smile. Just then, the lifeboat was lowered, and they splashed down into the sea. The crewmen at the oars rowed them away from the sinking ship. Grace turned around and saw the Titanic was sliding beneath the water in a huge cloud of steam. Katherine's father leaned over. Don't worry, Grace, he said with a kind expression on his face. We'll take care of you. As the lifeboat bobbed gently on the waves, Grace wondered what would happen next. She was only halfway to America, but at least she felt safe now. Safe for now, sitting between Katherine and her parents.